Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to a little poem. Can we call it a poem? We'll get into it. Perfections. This is poem number 8 of the 29 poems of By the Roadside. Now, there's any number of reasons, guys, why I love Leaves of Grass, and one of them is a little poem, a little offering like this. There are some in Whitman's day and even today who will look at this line and a half and say, come on, you can't call this a poem. Whatever it is you want to call it, it clearly is not a poem. It reminds me a lot of that little poem that ended Inscriptions. Do you remember it, thou reader? And later we'll see To Old Age. Right at the end, near the end of By the Roadside. We're going to see these little short, I like to think of them as reflections, as asides. I think that Whitman is having lots of fun in By the Roadside, but I think that there's some really profound stuff happening as well in his construction of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, and I'm going to try and point it out to you. There are people, and even Harold Bloom, who argued that a whole lot of Leaves of Grass is kind of a waste of time. And I take a little bit of issue with that. I argue that, yeah, there are some of the greatest poems, and we've clearly seen several of them already. We're getting to Lilacs later, and of course a few others. But I want to make the argument that when you pick up Leaves of Grass and you read it from start to finish, you find these amazing little gems, and I'm going to try and make the argument that even this little line and a half, what we call perfections, what he calls perfections, is in fact a pretty remarkable little passage of its own accord. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt is our playlist, and that you've been working with us from Inscriptions, I just mentioned, thou reader, all the way through up to and including an introductory set of comments for To the Roadside, and I'm hopeful that you've already watched that and studied that with me. And then we just finished with Learned Astronomer. Now let's turn to our Nortons quickly to hear what Nortons has to say about this little poem. Poem which first appeared in the 1860 edition and then was reprinted without change in all succeeding editions. In other words, no matter what you think of this poem, Whitman thought that this was a necessary poem to sit between two of his most anthologized poems, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer and O Me, O Life, which we will address here in a moment. The poem is Perfections, and right away notice the last line of Learned Astronomer, looked up in perfect silence at the stars. You'll remember that perfections is a word that gets used one other time in Leaves of Grass in Song of the Rolling Earth number 1. Perfections show. The poem runs like this. Only themselves understand themselves, and the like of themselves, as souls only understand souls. Now, I'm convinced that Whitman, when he puts a line and a half like this in the middle of Leaves of Grass, in the middle of Roadside, in the middle between Astronomer and O Me, O Life, two really precious offerings and poems, I think he's having a lot of fun. There are a number of ways to read this. I think this is almost like music, and this is why, to me, four quartets and the study that we have made of T.S. Eliot's four quartets, it has to be read in appreciation of Leaves of Grass, regardless of what Eliot himself had to say about it. It's clear to me that Eliot read a lot of Leaves of Grass, if not all of it, and I think he was impressed by these kinds of maybe almost like musical interludes. Notice the balancing of the line. Notice that we will begin with the word only, and we will then move to the word as. Notice that the word themselves will be repeated 3 times. And there's this brilliant balance that will be played here with the word perfections, but it never actually appears in the poem itself. Only themselves understand themselves. Now at 3a already, we can put our Descartes down there, I think, therefore I am, and the idea that there's a quest for understanding. In some ways, this word understand is one of the most important words in all of Leaves of Grass. Why? Because I think this is the longing for Whitman the poet, Whitman the teacher, pedagogue, Whitman the person, to try and understand. This is what great art always has tried to do, right? To try to help us understand our moment in time, past moments in time, future moments in time. We're always trying to find understanding. However, notice, only themselves understand themselves and the like of themselves. Now, again, I'm convinced Whitman's having so much fun. I mean, we teach what? We teach kids in elementary school about what a simile is, a comparison using like or as. Here the word like gets used, and then 2 lines or 3 words later, the word as gets used. I am convinced that Whitman is having a lot of fun here. What is it that he's saying? Well, this idea of identity, this idea of being measured, as we have commented on it so many times in our study of Lisa Grass, I think he's making a profound observation that there are certain things which can only be understood in certain ways and in certain times. One of the two-way observations, obviously, is that each of us comes to our own truth in our own way and in our own time. And I think Whitman was acutely aware of that. Only themselves understand themselves and the like of themselves. And then to use the comparison of the simile as souls only, back to the word only again, understand, back to the use of the word understand, souls. Well, what is it that we're actually saying? I think Whitman is playing around with the ancient Platonic tradition. I think he's definitely playing around with Republic's Book 7 in the cave allegory. And the idea that when you're sitting in a cave chained up looking at shadows on a wall, we've given the full lectures, obviously, at learnstrong.net, you think that what you're looking at in shadows on a wall are real, and they're not actually real at all. They're shadows. It's not to say they don't exist. We're just saying they're not real. And in the same way, individuals, their souls, individuals, their temperaments, their personalities, there's a certain kind of adhesiveness is this word that gets used so many times. In Lisa Grass, we've already commented on it so many times, that there's ability to identify with another will for Whitman only happen if it ever happens at all, because of a longing to understand. And that takes us now to our two-way observations. It takes one to know one is what we often say, right? It takes one to know one. Truth always will understand truth. I think here we have Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, beauty is truth, truth, beauty, that's all you know on earth and all you need to know. This idea of correspondence, this idea of adhesiveness, definitely playing around with it in 2B. I love this construction of only as only. And I love the idea of the role of the title. The role of the title Perfections takes us back to the last line of the previous, and then of course gets us ready for the really precious poem that's coming next, O Me, O Life. At 3A, I've mentioned Descartes already, but I actually want to challenge you to see a relationship here. Remember, our learning theory is to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. I want to challenge you to see the connection with Dante's Divine Comedy. I think Dante, one reading that certainly this poem helps me to appreciate Dante one more time. We've given full lectures over all of the Divine Comedy at learnstrong.net, and I would recommend them to you for review. But I think it's important to point out that what Dante is looking for, obviously his emancipation from the dark wood of error, but I think what he's longing for is to understand. And he's looking for identification, which is why Virgil is his guide. And of course, Virgil is an exemplar of that longing poet who is somehow trying to come to terms with what? Understanding. Understanding. Souls understand souls in some profound way. Of course, at 3B, to own a little short poem like this, well, we could obviously ask a couple of questions. Who understands your soul? That is to say, they get you. And where do you fall in regards to the souls that you know? Whose soul is it that you understand? And in the end, isn't that what we are all longing for? And I hope our study, our talks with Walt, are bringing us to a better understanding, not only of Whitman, not only of ourselves, but each other. Thank you.